The first part of this episode is basically my big long tirade against democracy, which was really fun to do and honestly got like much longer than I thought this section would, but there's just so much to say. And even here, I still frankly cut out so much content. Like I just could have went on forever and ever. It's a fun debate, like getting into people about the merits of democracy, because I wasn't intentional. This wasn't part of I did not start off this way. I was not so extreme in my like right-wing points of view when it comes to this. But I was like libertarian, and then I was curious about anarchism, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And then I discovered Moldbug, and I was like, that makes the most sense of anything I've ever heard. And he completely won me over, and I've only been progressively more won over as the years have went on. I don't like democracy. I've never voted. I don't plan on ever voting. And I'm not trying to dismantle democracy. So you don't have to worry about that. Like people tend to view when I say I don't like democracy that like I don't want, like I'm trying to change the status quo. No, I don't care about the status quo. I just care about alternatives to the status quo. And I think if you're trying to explore a novel political potentials, new possibilities, uninhibited by what has been, then voting isn't the way to do that. We've got better tools now. Money's a pretty good tool to get what you want. And so that's what I get into in this episode. I open it with just talking about this is like a very mainstream talking point at this point, how like liberal democracy is the modern faith. Like we used to have God and religion, and now people just worship the state and they love egalitarianism and whatever. And it kind of imparts people a certain moral righteousness. Like people get really, really defensive over their political society because that's like supplanted to some like, religious vector in their mind. And that's all fine and dandy. It's just also something to kind of be aware of. And then from that, I get into slave morality, which I don't think needs much elaboration. That's a pretty well discussed point at this time. This was actually, I was reading Bronze Age Mindset a while ago, and that had some good tidbits for this section. Kind of talking about how like our lives have, what does he say? Like our lives have been reduced to sort of like low grade titillation. So it's just all about like, like lots of food is available to you, lots of entertainment is available to you, lots of pornography is available to you, but getting access to experiences that like really speak to like deep carnal meaning, that will really like sustain you for a long time. Those experiences are quite hard to come by because when you live in a society that's so stifled and constrained that like the most agency you can exercise is like whatever really taboo Pornhub thing you're looking up, or like whatever ethnic food you're eating. And like those are our choice points. But in terms of like being able to really do something of your own accord with any degree of meaningful power, those opportunities are incredibly slim. And it's been engineered that way. What is the government structure philosophy you're currently supportive? I am all over the map here. I'm a philosopher, so I can't give you an easy reference point because everything is kind of an amalgamation of things I picked up from other people, but then synthesized in my own distinct way. I'll sometimes bump into thinkers that are kind of operating on a similar wavelength of me, and that's always very encouraging. But all the specifics and nuances, like this is all coming from my brain. So structure of government, as I will get into here, basically I want people to exist in whatever political systems they want. As I was saying earlier, like, I just don't think democracy is the best way to get what you want in our current day and age. And as I'll be about to elaborate upon, I think democracy kind of has a lot more faults than it does virtues when it comes to like, okay, I live in Canada. There's 30 million Canadians or so living here, and we live in this massive country. Why is it that we need to like butt heads and fight with one another over like the details of the political system that we're living inside of? Wouldn't it be better if you could do like, and this is the founding fathers' original vision with the states, right? It's like you're going to have this, like, okay, you're all united in a single territory or whatever, but you're split up into all these micro states that are going to have different rule sets that are controlling the, nuances and differences between how the different states operate. And so that way, depending on the time of life that you're living in, your overall value orientation, you can go and move to a place that better reflects your values, and the whole country doesn't have to operate by the same principles. But over time in the United States, like the federal government got more and more power and the states became more and more homogenized. And there's still like obviously meaningful differences between them. But it's not as extreme maybe as was the initial vision. And so I'm quite interested in basically ways that you can step outside of like the status quo framework that you exist inside of, instead of trying to turn around and convince like 30 million people or 300 million people if you're an American, like, hey guys, we should all do this thing. It's like, don't worry about trying to convince other people. Go find other people that already agree with you. And this is I won't say a technology, like The Sovereign Individual is a book that influenced this episode a lot, which was written in the 90s and is excellent at being extremely predictive of lots of like trends that we're seeing now in like the 2010s and 2020s. Like they predicted cryptocurrency and stuff like that before it was a real thing. It's a really good book. Being connected online like we are right now, it's like, oh, you can actually create a little community on the internet or network with people that live across the world that maybe speak a different first language than you and all this other stuff. And yet you can be like, hey, we're both really inspired by this sort of way of life or this sort of philosophical system or this sort of political ideal. And we could all now start talking, getting it together and being actionable in the real world and making meaningful change. Not in your broad, I'm not trying to like revolutionize Toronto, but like, oh, hey, what if 10,000 of us who get on the exact same page about what we want politically go and get access to like a little island somewhere in the Mediterranean. This is like what Praxis is trying to do, a city-state group. Or if you know who Balaji Srinivasan is, then like the network state, this is the idea that he's popularized a lot. And like I know about Balaji, but like I was coming to these ideas before I'd encountered him. And so this is what I mean about like you kind of start dovetailing with other thinkers serendipitously, which is quite nice. So basically the idea of like being able to opt out of a current system that you're not a fan of, and then use current technology and communication capacity, and also just frankly the fact that we can travel much more easily than we could before, and then go build communities online and then start materializing in the real world in whatever form that might take. Specifically, I don't like democracy as a way of getting things done. I like, this is an idea from Curtis Yarvin or Mencius Moldbug, the idea of kind of treating the state like a business, like any other service that you would want access to if you're paying like, you know, $10 a month for Netflix or something. There's a baseline assumption of like, or like an Equinox membership, right? You're like, I'm going to pay the $250 a month to go to Equinox and I'm going to get access to these things. It's just like a normal commerce relationship. And if you started treating countries like that, or even just like city-states like that, like micronations, where it's like a pay-to-play situation, where instead of having your taxes based off of like your income or whatever it is, so it's just like a flat fee of, okay, your tax is going to be $10K a month, and maybe there's extra bonus taxes if you want to have like extra nice features, just like there is in any sort of subscription platform. You just pay the money up front, and there's a guarantee what you get out on the other end. And if you become a dissatisfied customer, then you always maintain your right to just leave and move somewhere else that will do a better job at fulfilling your desires. And then if you had a bunch of different systems that were all doing this, competing with one another, the market dynamics take over, and then all of those states start improving in quality because they're competing for customers, rather than controlling their citizens who don't actually get to opt in or out of the system. So it's kind of like making the social contract, which was like a philosophical proposition, but it isn't like actually a real thing of like a bunch of guys getting together and being like, hey, we're going to start a city, and they all sign a contract as to what it looks like. It'll be making that like a real practical thing, in that you're signing on volitionally to be like, okay, I'm going to go live in Elon Musk utopia, and he's going to give me a flying car, and he's going to give me free energy and free Wi-Fi, and I'm going to pay $10K a year to live here. And if I, try to kill anyone, they're going to kick me out, that sort of thing. So like it's very explicit, like here's what like the costs are, here's what the benefits are, what like the rules are, and you're signing on to that as like an active decision, rather than like currently passively, like you just turn 18 and it's like, great, you're an adult now, here's all of your responsibilities and rights and like forbidden things you can't do, and no one's sitting you down and explaining this to you. You never, like, it's always bizarre to me when people will get like put in prison for committing a crime that they didn't know was a crime. And I don't think that's fair or right, frankly. I think it should be a much more active process of you participating in your governmental structure. The next chapter is The God That Failed, which is basically, this is what I was talking about earlier, like, I'll just burst through these points because there's so many. Democracy relies upon debation in order to function. It kind of fuels inherent antagonism between people, because instead of us being able to just go our separate ways when we have a difference of opinion, it's like now one of us needs to win, and the other person winning means the other person is losing. And so now you have, the American political climate or whatever. Also the compulsion, right? So it's like, okay, if your candidate loses the election, now the winning side is like forcing their desired version of reality upon you. So now you're going to have half of society always being embittered and angry at the other side of society. So like this is not conducive to social harmony whatsoever. And it just doesn't feel necessary to me. I wrote like the only real difference between democracy and totalitarianism is how many people are telling you what to do. It's like they're both totalitarian. It's just amount of, is it one dictator or like, 15 million? individual ones that all have a micro influence. People say like, oh, democracy is like the fairest form of governance because everyone gets to say, everyone gets to influence the outcome. But what this actually means is that everyone's like your personal prerogative, like individually, you probably have a quite more specific version of how we want the society to operate, but you need to kind of water both on a personal level and then also the political candidates need to water down their like utopic ideal to a more like generalized median thing to appeal to the most people or to be able to get the person that's actually like running for office into power. And so no one's like actually getting their ideal system put into place. Everyone's getting a compromised version of the system. So no one's really happy with the outcome. Like it's saying like, oh, everyone gets to influence the outcome, but really that means everyone gets to influence an outcome that nobody wants. And so that seems silly to me. We don't need to be doing that. Yeah, and then people are just constantly like dissatisfied with whatever the status quo is and everyone's frustrated, blah, blah, blah. And obviously all the like third party influences that have an impact on the political system, yet we are not able to interface with or influence in any sort of way, right? So like there's so many regulations that are put in place, there's so many special interest groups and so many lobbyists and other kind of like, you know, foreign interests, all the rest of the things that will be able to influence how your political system unfolds, even though they're not being voted into those positions. Those things just kind of come and put these blockades in the way of you going down the path of progress that you want. And then I got into this chapter is called the control complex, and I talk about basically how like democracy has always been understood to be a bad form of governance. This is like persisted since Plato. Like everyone reads Plato's Republic. It's like one of the first things you do in like an introduction to philosophy class or political theory. And like these ideas are well established and well discussed, but we kind of, you know, you read about the what do you even call them? Philosopher kings, and you're like, aha, these silly Greeks. But you know, maybe someone should try it out one day. I mean, just maybe someone should try it because it's been well established why these things don't work out. The problem of democracy is an issue of incentives. And so basically, if people want power and they live in a democratic system, then they will manipulate the political system in order to acquire power, which naturally corrupts the political system. So that's actually not the person who wants power in like the Nietzschean Machiavellian sense. Like if they just went into business or something, then they could be acquiring power. But if they're trying to get political power, then they need to corrupt the system in order to get the power. But that's not really their fault. It's the fault of the system, because if you could just become your own dictator and have all the power, then you wouldn't need, like the system wouldn't be corrupt because the system would be doing exactly what it says on the tin. And so then of course this other thing about if a civilization is governed by the ballot box and subject to frequent changes in leadership, then it's going to prioritize votes over outcomes. And like there's not actually this, I mean, this is something that's started to blow my mind the more I think about it. It's just so bizarre, the fact that we have like 4-year terms, and then also and like in the United States you only have like up to 2 terms, which is just bonkers, because it's like, how on earth do you expect, like imagine if you're trying to do a class project in like school and there's like 30 people in your class, and like one person gets up and like you're supposed to be doing a class presentation on something, and one person gets up and starts presenting, and then 4 minutes in, the teacher hits a buzzer, and then a new kid has to get up and pick up exactly where the last guy left off and continue doing a coherent presentation. And you just keep doing that. Like you hit the buzzer, new guy goes up, hit the buzzer. It's like, you cannot have any sort of long-term vision, consistency, coherence, planning. It all goes out the window. Like if you want to do have a political system that's going to have any sort of longevity or success, or be capable of, you know, taking on real intense big projects that require decades. Like decades isn't a very long amount of time, but we literally, it's impossible for anyone to be in power for decades. I mean, I'm Canadian, so maybe a little bit, but like in Canada too, it's like you're just pushing widgets like millimeters one side or the other. At least in America, there's like more velocity to the extremes. But then even that, it just means now you're like punching back and forth this way and that way, which is so just everyone's getting frustrated, because it's like, oh, we were so close to having the communist utopia, and now we're going back into fascist hell, and we're so close to having the, you know, the Fourth Reich, and now we're going like, so you're constantly like splitting and diverging and losing the plot. And so nobody can actually advance their political goals in any meaningful sense. It's all just being like slammed into this median goo. And who wants that? No one, like all the extremists can't go anywhere with their ideals, and then all the normies can't even live their normal life because they're getting like squished both ways too. So no one's happy. In just our like subjective firsthand experience, we can feel the dysfunction weighing out against any sort of like kumbaya notions of things. Or like when I was at like the studio the other day, the CCCRU, I was talking with some of the guys, and he was saying like, oh, like, the value of democracy lies in like the sort of cybernetic idea, right? Of like the people will, steer the ship in the right direction over time, and maybe you'll kind of over adjust this way and over adjust that way, but overall you're going to get where you're going the best way. Okay, sure, fair enough. But that's not what's happening, because democracy isn't like I think you guys probably know cybernetics, right? Like, okay, you're trying to like adjust a thermostat, steer ship, whatever. You're like, okay, I gotta turn this. Like, you're trying to go straight, but you need to keep turning the wheel because there's wind and waves and all these other factors at play. So this is like you're trying to maintain a steadfast course, but to do that, you have to go left and right at different times. So it's a good analogy for politics. But the problem is that democracy. Who says this? This is a Landian thing, I think. Democracy, at least, describes it as ratcheting left. So it's like if you're steering the wheel and you're going like this, but every time you go like this, it like locks into place. And then your boat starts curving in a way that now like you're trying to go straight towards the island, but each time you ratchet it more leftward, like because of, regulations and the fact that it's much easier to put things into law than it is to take things out of law again. And people adjust to a certain norm of having whatever social services, and you can't, like, they're like, oh, these wartime social services, and the war is over 50 years later, and people are like, you can't take away our social services, blah, blah, blah. So like you start ratcheting it more and more left, and now you're no longer steering the boat where you want it to go anymore, and you start actually just spinning in circles. And so I don't think it works in the cybernetic like ideal of it, because people aren't accounting for the actual political structures and then also the actual people participating in the political process. That means that on the whole, you can view politics as like this, like left, right, like waiting back and forth. But democracy isn't the path to get there. That's just talking about politics on any scale. That could be in any system, the weighting of the two left and right extremes. It's like you need to juggle these two depending on the context that you're living in, yes. But sometimes the better juggler is one guy is juggling, and when you're not like throwing balls all over between your friends and one guy's holding on, like, it gets too complicated. I write, the truth of the situation is that leaders are prisoners of the present political system just as much as the public. So again, this idea of like, even if you are in a high position of power in a democratic system and people, have their strong opinions about you, it's like, it's not their fault. It's nobody's fault. It's just everyone's born into the system, and that's the status quo. And if you're trying to get money or power or influence or praise, then going into politics might be a way that you decide to do that, in which case you will do what you need to do in order to get yourself the outcome that you want. But that's not your fault. That's just incentive games. And so what I talk about basically is like, these incentives are broken, but if people are using the incentives to get an outcome that you don't like, that isn't really their fault either. It's systemic. I'm a leftist. Chapter 4 is titled "The Colony Has No Queen," and I open it talking about like tipping points. There's always going to be these transitional points where it's like you reach a certain threshold or a certain boiling point, and suddenly you enter a new phase change, and everything's different. And this is basically like the information era is ushering in a new age for us. Like we did the agricultural revolution, we did the industrial revolution, and now we've got like the information revolution, and that's going to create new political outcomes. As I was mentioning earlier, the sovereign individual of now agency is going to be more vested in the individual, because it's like you've got your own money that's not connected to fiat systems. We can communicate in weird encrypted chat rooms with people across the globe. You can move around, you can hop in an airplane. So you're no longer like a medieval peasant that's just like stuck with your shit. Like you are enabled to create your own reality much more than you could in the past. And then this being just the classic like dark Enlightenment maxim of like voting with your dollar and your feet instead of with your ballot is like going to be the way forward to start making the sorts of changes you want to be experiencing in your political society. Is just, instead of trying to change downtown Toronto to be as I want it to be, I should be making a podcast and talking about politics online. And maybe by the time I'm 60, there'll be a new city state that was founded off of Wonderland's principles. And wouldn't that be cool? Decentralizing and re-centralizing is just, this is all like very Landian, like everything's mobile and everything's constantly in flux and constantly reorganizing itself. And the edges of the system are where exploration and novelty happens. That starts kind of reintegrating the edges and creating new structures and doing more explorations, blah, blah, blah. And then in the same part, I also then talk about how we kind of got cities that got really, really dense because of industrialization. And now we've even seen just through the pandemic and stuff like that, like now it's like, wait a minute, we don't need to be working in factories or working in office buildings. We can start going to smaller and smaller communities again and living more locally, which is better for our psychologies because it's more in alignment with our monkey brains and stuff like that. And then also when you're in smaller municipalities, then you can have more effective governance because you're not trying to govern, Toronto's population is like 10 million. You're trying to govern like 10,000 people or something. And when you know everyone in your city, and then you've got higher trust, there's higher like efficiency, accountability, blah, blah, blah. It's all self-explanatory, just like localism. This section is titled Outcomes Over Inputs, and I'm basically just saying that like people, when it comes to politics, what you care about isn't actually the way that you get the thing, that you care about the thing that you get. And so if it's more effective to get what you want through having evil dictator king type tyrant who's running the system over having like everyone holding hands and voting for their best guy, if that turns out to be more effective in creating the outcomes that you want, if people are happier and more prosperous and healthier and everything else, then people will shift towards that because it's just utilitarianism. And then also I kind of start getting into the like state as a service situation and just making that you are already treating the state like a service, like you need to pay their taxes in order for the state to continue perpetuating itself. But if you're to start making that relationship more something that we're explicitly conscious of and interfacing with, instead of being like an implicit thing that you're being forced to participate in, even if you don't like what's happening, that would be a preferable state of affairs. If you're a really successful businessman and you could be an even more successful fucking monarch, then people would start doing that. People would go into government if it was the salaries you could make and the profit you could make was competitive with being in the private sector. But it isn't, for obvious reasons, in our current framework, because people think that would be bad. But actually, if it wasn't that way, it would be better. This is another thing he talks about, Lee Kuan Yew, in the From Third World to First, is saying like he always made sure that he would pay to people on his staff in a way that was competitive with what there's something in my eye, with what they'd be making in the private sector. I don't think he said he'd give them exactly the private sector wages, but I think it was something like two-thirds or something like that, where it's like you're kind of competitive, and then maybe there's a little bit like some percentage is lost because you're being like, well, I'm getting the clout and ego of being like, you know, helping lead the country. But frankly, you should be paying them more than they'd be making in the private sector, and that would be keeping the best guys on your team. Battle of ideas. Oh, this is a fun little section. Basically, this gets a little bit more philosophical suddenly, where basically I'm saying like, okay, you know, let the 100 flowers bloom in terms of different cities, different states, different places doing their own versions of politics. Some can be democratic, some can be fascist, some can be, you know, communist. You can do any sorts of political societies you want. And over time, you will naturally, the ideas that work will simmer up and the ones that don't will fall down. And your kind of this more abstracted view of these different political ideologies competing will naturally just, you know, Darwinian select themselves into and out of existence. And that's just the way of the world, isn't it? What's the counter for keeping tyrannical governments contained? Is there some network representing that? Hey, Duck, you got to tell me what the counter is IRL right now. There's like, the counter is just what I'm saying here with the battle of ideas things is like, tyrannies don't really last very long because people don't really like living under tyrannies. Right? So like it's hard, and it takes a lot of energy. This is something that Nick Land was saying in an interview he did on the Hermetics podcast, which is a really good interview. It's only like an hour long, and he's talking about how in like Maoist China, how like the amount of energy that it took to just prevent people from trying to do any little micro version of capitalism and trade was like, you're constantly needing to put pressure on the system just to hold it in this version of stagnation that is actually antithetical to all of its impulses of like, it's like the weeds are constantly trying to shoot up in like the cracks between the concrete. And the amount of time you have to go through like using pliers to get every single blade of grass out is like, it's just not gonna last very long because the whole thing is like vibrating, desperate to break out of it. And so that's the countermeasure is just the fact that tyranny, like genuine tyranny that isn't like my like joking like benevolent fascism thing, like real tyrannies fall apart because people don't like living under that. And so you're putting your society under the same pressure chamber, and then all of your rule has to be dedicated to like making sure that your people don't rebel against you and overthrow the government. When you're looking at a problem and you're too zoomed in on the here and now, you're missing the context of the broader picture, and you have to zoom out more to see how like those little things will go, those arcs will come and go, and things that don't work tend to fall apart. But having a globalized network, I mean, having a network is fine, let's be fair, but having like a top-down system to go identify the tyrannies and get them out just becomes its own tyranny. And so when people talk about having like one world government in order to prevent people from being tyrants, I'm like, it's very ironic, isn't it? My stance is basically like, okay, if you're going to have, like, just for sake of argument, you're going to have like Elon Muskville. He comes on Twitter, he's like, I'm making Elon Muskville, here's where it's going to be, these are the laws, blah, blah, blah. And people decide to start moving there. And then there's the fear of like, what if the United States is just going to nuke Elon Muskville because they hate techno capital and they hate Elon Musk. It's like, okay, wait a minute. All of the people that moved to Elon Muskville are expats or they're extremely wealthy foreigners. That's the first problem. Is like you're gonna go and kill like you don't need to have a strong military if you're just like an offshoot of like America and you're just operating by a slightly different structure. And then also it would be such a like self-own really. Like why are you're so scared of capitalism? You're so threatened by like 10,000 tech bros like chilling on some island somewhere that you're gonna like go to war over it. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Obviously in like the longer term, over like the course of hundreds of years or whatever, sure, you do probably want to have some sort of defense system in place as much as you can. But I also think like we're just moving into a more peaceful future, and this idea of like attacking a foreign nation because they're operating by like, it's not like you're going to be making North Korea. You're going to be making like a techno capital utopia. And so it'd be quite bold of other countries to be like, fuck the utopians. We're going to attack them for that. It just seems silly to me. And it doesn't seem like a big cause for concern. It's like one of those things that's easy counter argument, like, oh yeah, but what about the nukes? Checkmate, your city state is fucked. But I'm like, are you thinking why would they do that? You're just gonna murder a bunch of random rich dudes because you don't like the fact that they're practicing Georgism and they've got drones as their lights and they're not paying taxes in a conventional way. Like it just doesn't make sense practically. It's like it's putting too much malevolence into the broader system that I don't actually think is there. Like I think a lot of this dysfunction, although I was joking about the cathedral earlier, it's like I do think the vast majority of dysfunction in our current just overall global climate isn't due to malevolence. It's due to good intentions gone wrong and incompetence. And if you are able to be competent and lead by example and demonstrate that there's a better way to do things, people actually desperately want solutions. It's not that they're so evil that they're trying to, break anything good before it can happen. They just don't know any better. And so if you're able to step outside of the system enough to make a better alternative and then prove them wrong over time when they're saying this isn't going to work, that's not going to work, this is going to be disastrous, and then just demonstrate through people living out in the alternative society, no, that's actually not the case, no, look how much better people are doing here, then people will follow. They'll be like, oh, thank fuck somebody tried doing Georgism and actually they're thriving and actually we're trying it here now and our people are thriving too. And, that situation. And just getting on with Balaji and the idea of like forming a community first and then going and territorializing later once you've got a solid groundwork of some philosophy and principle and system and economy and everything else already in place. And this kind of like a grassroots, bottom-up driven formation of new political entities. That sort of thing. And then vision and value. Oh yeah, when I talked to Yarvin, he recommended I read Ancient Cities, which is a good little book about the, ancient Greece and Rome. And from that, I got this little quip that the ancients founded a city all at once, all in an entire day. Isn't that beautiful? They'd plan everything out and then get it all good to go. And then in one day they'd be like, we're opening Rome, and then like cut the ribbon and everyone would come in, and it's like they did it all in one day. It's wonderful. And so I think that's really nice because again, that kind of horseshoes back to like this more modern political vision of the future of being like, yeah, you would found a city in a day. It wouldn't be this like this slowly emergent entity because like the political process would click on overnight, right? Like the city would expand and emerge in capacity. But this idea of like overnight, we're going from like ideating and building and working out all the nuances to then being like, okay, guys, it's time to move in. Like, let's go. I just think that's wonderful. If you're interested in starting a new society, you need to recruit producers, not consumers. You got to have people that are interested building and developing, not people that just want to like come and sip their pina colada and do their remote work job on like a nice like resort like situation. Those people come later because those ones are easy to find. The people that are hard to find are the people that want to plan Georgism from the bottom up and figure out all the nuances of how you're going to actually implement that in a modern society. No one is adopting Singaporean or Dubai politics, even though it worked well. Yeah, this is going to change in time though. Like, but this is 21st century's era of the city-states. So like we've got, Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong, obviously, and there's lots of projects to make ones that are like a pure like techno-capital vision of that, where it's like doing like the Balaji like network city thing. But I think the problem is that they're all doing it completely the wrong way around. Like I was brought onto Praxis like a few years ago, and I've not seen Praxis do anything yet that's given me a shred of confidence in their project or that in its longevity or vitality that they claim it will possess, because it's a completely unprincipled approach. And so I initially I started doing Wonderland because I was like, I want to talk about ideas and philosophy online and start sharing opinions that I have that I haven't seen other people discussing. And then as I got more and more into the work and landed upon this like city state thing, I've kind of realized like, oh, mm, reluctantly, I feel like now it's my responsibility to get this ball rolling, at least from a philosophical community building point of view, in my lifetime, because at some point your frustration with the lack of good leadership requires you to step up as a leader. And because I've done all the work, like Wonderland is the backbone, it's the spine, it's the treatise, and I can spend the next 5 years of my life developing a very strong community of people that are very passionate about this, that want to get into all the weeds with me, because I love being in the weeds of like, okay, let's specifically figure out exactly how we're going to do all the nuances in every single aspect of the political structure, all over the map when it comes to city planning and justice and I don't know, divorces, like all the weird ass things that you have to think about if you're trying to actually create a whole city from scratch. But most of the people that are trying to do this project, they're like, I just give me Bitcoin and I'm gonna make a resort in Honduras. And that's not the same thing. That's Disney World for adults, and I don't want to do Disney World for adults, like because people just want to make like tax havens for themselves, more or less, like a tax haven in a nice tropical climate. Like we've already done that before, but the idea of like, no, no, no. If you're interested in the politics of it, you should be interested in like, well, what radical reforms are you wanting to implement, and how is the whole system comprehensive and philosophically tethered to something that people can get excited about and on board with. And thus far, I've also not seen anyone doing this, which like surprises me, because I don't know. Like Balaji talks a lot about the network state stuff, and the same with Moldbug too. Like it seems like he kind of moved away from his earlier writing and is now more interested about like regime change in the United States. But he's also very, very, like, I know because I spoke with him, like he does not have much good things to say about the current city-state people, because they're all just being really goofy nerds, like tech bros about it. And yeah, I'm shocked that there aren't more people doing what I'm trying to do online, which is like, let me think from scratch and generate all of the philosophy and principles and politics first, and then go and do all the other steps, and not just try to like get some, finance backing and then start making it up as you go along. Because that to me is like a recipe for disaster. And that's what all the ones historically have been doing.